Judge Frank Caprio had barely lifted the file in front of him when the courtroom doors burst open and an angry driver stormed in, his voice echoing through the chamber before anyone could stop him as he pointed directly at the judge and shouted, "I shouldn't even be here. This whole system is a joke." The room froze instantly. Spectators stiffened, officers exchanged sharp glances, and even the clerk hesitated mid-motion, stunned by the man's explosive entrance. But Judge Caprio didn't flinch. He didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't lean back, didn't respond at all. He simply watched the man with an unreadable calm that made the driver's anger look even more out of place, as if yelling into a silent ocean. The driver continued ranting, slamming his crumpled ticket on the podium, muttering insults under his breath, calling the entire court unfair, and accusing Judge Caprio of not knowing how real people live. While the judge's stillness drew the tension tighter and tighter, pulling the entire room into a single, breathless moment. Everyone waited for Judge Caprio to finally react, to defend himself, to reprimand the man, to restore order, but he didn't say a word. And that silence, more powerful than any shout, became the first sign that the man had no idea what kind of judge he was actually dealing with. The man finally reached the podium, breathing hard as if he had sprinted all the way from the parking lot, his hands shaking with a rage he didn't bother hiding. And as he looked Judge Caprio in the eye, the disgust on his face was unmistakable. He ripped his ticket open and waved it aggressively, saying, "You think you can just fine people without knowing a damn thing about what they're going through." His tone wasn't just irritated, carried a deep personal bitterness, the kind that comes from someone convinced the world is stacked against him. The courtroom watched with widening eyes as he continued, leaning forward as though trying to challenge the judge with his physical presence alone. Every word he spoke dripped with frustration. How he was late for work, how the city feeds off hardworking people, and how judges sit up there pretending to understand real life. The man wasn't just angry. He was looking for someone to blame, someone to lash out at, someone to absorb the weight of everything he'd bottled up for months. His voice cracked between fury and desperation. Yet Judge Caprio stayed impossibly quiet. His hands folded, his eyes steady, studying the man not with judgment, but with a depth of patience that made several spectators shift uncomfortably. The contrast between the driver's explosive rage and the judge's unshaken silence created a tension so sharp it felt like the air itself could split. And still, the man kept going, unaware that the more he spoke, the more he was exposing something deeper than anger. Something even he hadn't realized was about to come out. The driver's anger didn't fade after his rant of anything. It intensified as he realized Judge Caprio was still sitting there silently, unbothered, unreadable, refusing to give him even the smallest reaction. And that silence worked on him like fuel poured straight onto a flame. He leaned even closer toward the bench, his voice rising, his words turning sharper, more careless, more reckless, as he snapped, "Are you even listening? Or do you just sit there pretending to care like every other judge in this city?" Gasps rippled through the courtroom, a few spectators stiffening while others exchanged nervous looks, shocked that someone would talk to Judge Caprio, the man known for compassion, respect, patience in such a disrespectful, almost taunting tone. The driver didn't stop. He tapped the podium repeatedly, each smack louder than the last, and sneered, "People worship you online. But let's be honest, you only act kind when cameras are on. Off camera, you're just like every other judge who doesn't understand what real struggle looks like." Even the officers shifted now, their hands instinctively moving toward their belts, unsure if they should approach or wait for the judge's signal. But Judge Caprio didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't defend himself. His silence held steady, quiet but powerful, and the more peaceful it stayed, the more unhinged the driver's frustration became, as if he needed the judge to react just to prove that his anger mattered. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just watching a confrontation, they were watching a man unravel in real time. Unaware that the stillness of the judge he was trying so hard to provoke was setting the stage for a truth he never expected to face. Judge Frank Caprio sat perfectly still, his face calm and his hands gently folded, while the angry driver continued spiraling, and that silence, sharp, heavy, almost intimidating in its own right, began shifting the entire atmosphere of the courtroom in a way the driver hadn't anticipated. The quieter the judge remained, the louder the man's insecurity echoed through the room, as if every insult thrown at the bench bounced back at him with double the weight. Spectators who had been bracing for a shouted reprimand or a stern warning watched. Instead, as Judge Caprio absorbed every word with a patience that felt almost unnatural, a stillness so controlled it made people forget he governed the entire courtroom. Officers who were ready to move paused when they noticed the judge's subtle signal, just a slight raise of his hand. It's barely noticeable, but powerful enough to say, "Stand down, let him speak." And so the man kept pushing, expecting anger, expecting outrage, expecting even the smallest crack in the judge's calm, but nothing came. The judge's steady gaze never sharpened, never narrowed, never showed offense. It simply remained fixed on the man with a depth of understanding that only someone with decades of human experience could hold. Slowly, the driver's voice faltered, not because he was finished, but because the silence was swallowing his anger, reflecting it back at him, revealing how much of it came not from this courtroom, not from Judge Caprio, but from somewhere deeper inside himself. He shifted his weight, suddenly less sure, suddenly less loud. And for the first time since he walked through the door, he seemed almost confused by his own rage. In that moment, Judge Caprio's silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy, compassion, and discipline woven together so tightly that everyone in the room felt the shift, realizing that the judge wasn't ignoring the man. He was waiting for the exact moment when the truth would surface on its own. Judge Frank Caprio finally leaned forward ever so slightly, not with authority, not with judgment, but with a gentleness that instantly softened the tension in the room. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same warmth and understanding that had calmed thousands of storm-struck defendants before this man. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what happened this month?" A simple question, yet so sincere, so human, that it landed heavier than any reprimand ever could. The driver stiffened, as though the words had pierced straight through the hard shell he had been hiding behind. And for a moment, he tried to swallow the emotion rising in his throat, blinking rapidly to keep the tears from forming. The spectators sensed the shift immediately. Even those who had judged him seconds earlier now watched him with an unexpected empathy as the anger on his face slowly dissolved into something tired, defeated, and undeniably painful. Judge Caprio didn't rush him, didn't push, didn't interrogate. He held the silence like a soft cushion beneath the man's collapsing defenses, inviting him to breathe for the first time since he walked in. And in that fragile space, the driver finally exhaled a shaky breath and said, "I lost my job 2 weeks ago," his voice cracking as he added, "and my mom's been in the hospital. I've been trying to handle everything, and then I get this stupid ticket, and it just broke me." The courtroom fell completely still, not out of shock, but out of a shared understanding that this wasn't a reckless man attacking a judge. This was someone drowning, clinging to anger because it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Judge Caprio nodded slowly, his eyes softening with a compassion that felt almost fatherly. And in that moment, he wasn't a judge handing down decisions, he was a human being meeting another human being exactly where their pain had finally surfaced. Just as the driver's voice trembled into silence and the entire courtroom absorbed the weight of his confession, The heavy wooden doors creaked open again, and a sharply dressed man stepped inside wearing a city inspector badge clipped to his belt and carrying a stack of files pressed tightly against his chest. His eyes scanned the room until they locked onto the angry driver, and his expression shifted instantly from neutral professionalism to cold irritation. Without waiting for permission, he strode forward and announced loudly, "Your Honor, I need to bring something to your attention about this man," sending a ripple of confusion through the spectators who sensed a new storm brewing. The driver's face drained of color the moment he recognized the inspector, and that flicker of fear so sudden, so undeniable, made the courtroom murmur with curiosity. The inspector slapped the files onto the clerk's desk and continued, "This isn't just about a parking ticket. He's been reported multiple times for aggressive confrontations with city staff. 3 warnings, 2 formal complaints, and last week he threatened one of our officers." Gasps filled the room as the driver took a step back, shaking his head, whispering, "No, no, that's not what happened." But the inspector kept going, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "And he stormed into the city office yesterday, screaming at a receptionist scared her so badly she had to be escorted out." The man's anger evaporated instantly, replaced by a quiet panic as the truth he tried to hide now unraveled publicly, stripping away every excuse he had used to justify his rage. Judge Caprio didn't react. He simply watched the man with that same calm, steady gaze, as if he had expected this moment long before it arrived. The driver looked around desperately, his chest heaving, his earlier bravado collapsing under the weight of the inspector's words. And in that breathless moment, the courtroom realized the real twist. The man hadn't just been angry at the world. He had been losing control for far longer than anyone knew. And Judge Caprio's silence hadn't just drawn out the truth. It had exposed the storm inside him that no amount of yelling could hide. The inspector's sudden revelation swept through the courtroom like a shockwave. And the spectators who moments earlier felt sympathy for the driver now shifted uneasily in their seats, their expressions tightening as they processed the truth that had just crashed into the room. A woman in the front row instinctively pulled her purse closer, her eyes widening with the kind of fear that comes only when someone realizes the person they pitied might actually be dangerous. An older man shook his head slowly, whispering to the person beside him, "I knew something was off. Nobody gets that angry for nothing," while another spectator leaned back with a deep exhale, muttering, "So this wasn't his first meltdown." Even the officers exchanged glances, not alarmed this time, but resigned, as though they now understood why the man's rage carried a sharpness that felt practiced, repeated, habitual. The driver, sensing the shift in the room, began looking around desperately, his earlier dominance replaced by a frantic plea for anyone to believe his version of events. But every pair of eyes that met his reflected disappointment, caution, or quiet judgment. The sympathy he had started to earn evaporated from the room, replaced by a wary tension, and for the first time, he seemed truly alone at the podium, stripped of the anger he once used like armor. A whisper spread from the back row to the front like a chain reaction, people wondering how close they had been to witnessing another outburst, another confrontation, another escalation. And through it all, Judge Caprio remained still, absorbing the shifting energy of the room, understanding better than anyone that the courtroom was no longer reacting to a ticket or a confession. They were reacting to the realization that the man's rage wasn't a momentary loss of control, it was a pattern, one that everyone now saw with painful clarity. Judge Frank Caprio finally straightened in his chair, the calmness in his eyes sharpening into a quiet authority that immediately settled the room. And as the angry driver stood trembling at the podium, surrounded by the weight of the inspector's revelations and the courtroom's shifting judgment, the silence felt almost sacred, like everyone was holding their breath for the moment the judge would finally speak. When Caprio did open his mouth, his voice wasn't harsh or loud, but firm, steady, and unmistakably decisive, carrying the kind of truth that couldn't be argued with. "You walked into this courtroom today with anger," he said softly. "Anger so loud you couldn't hear yourself. But what concerns me is not the ticket. It's the pattern." The driver's eyes flickered with panic as the judge continued. "I listened to your pain. I understood your struggles. But struggles don't give anyone permission to intimidate, threaten, or hurt others. Not city staff, not officers, not strangers, and certainly not this courtroom." The man lowered his gaze, shoulders collapsing under the weight of his own reflection, as Judge Caprio gently placed the file on his desk. "Here is my verdict," he said, his tone compassionate but unwavering. "Your fine for the ticket is dismissed not because you deserve it, but because I choose to show mercy where anger has already cost you too much." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, but the judge raised a hand for silence before delivering the part that tightened every chest in the room. "But," he continued, "you will be required to attend mandatory anger management counseling. This is not punishment. This is protection for others and protection for you. Because if you continue down this road, no judge, no officer, no law will save you from the consequences." The driver's eyes filled with tears he didn't dare let fall, as Judge Caprio leaned forward with a softness that cut deeper than any sharp tone could. "You're not a bad man," he said gently. "You're a man who is hurting. But healing cannot begin while you're still shouting at the world." In that moment, the verdict wasn't just a ruling, it was a lifeline. And everyone in the room felt the gravity of a judge who had chosen compassion, accountability, and courage all at once. The driver stood frozen at the podium, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths as Judge Caprio's words settled into him like a truth he had spent years trying to outrun. And for the first time since he walked into the courtroom, his shoulders softened not in defeat, but in a quiet, exhausted surrender that looked like a man finally acknowledging the weight he'd been carrying alone. The spectators watched him with a new kind of understanding, no longer seeing the furious stranger who had stormed in moments earlier, but a broken man who had finally collided with the consequences of his own pain. And the shift was so palpable that even the officers, still alert and watchful, seemed to relax just slightly. The inspector, who had arrived ready to expose him, now looked at the driver with something closer to pity than irritation, as if recognizing that beneath the complaints and confrontations was someone who didn't need punishment, he needed help. The driver swallowed hard, his voice barely steady as he whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor," and though the words trembled out of him, they carried a sincerity that silenced the room. Judge Caprio nodded gently, offering him a look that belonged more to a father than a figure of authority, a look that told him redemption was possible if he was willing to reach for it. Slowly, the man stepped back from the podium, moving with a softer posture, as though the verdict had lifted a weight he didn't realize had become part of his body. And as he walked toward the exit, the once judgmental murmurs of the crowd were replaced by a quiet, shared reflection, a reminder that anger is often just grief in disguise, and that sometimes the strongest justice comes not from punishment, but from understanding. Judge Caprio gathered the next file calmly, his expression steady. But everyone knew the courtroom had just witnessed something far deeper than a simple hearing. They had witnessed a moment where a man's life bent gently toward healing, guided not by authority, but by compassion. As the driver quietly exited the courtroom, leaving behind the anger that had once defined him and carrying instead the fragile possibility of change, the room settled into a reflective stillness, the kind that lingers long after a powerful moment has passed, reminding everyone present that what they had witnessed wasn't just a case, it was a life being gently steered back toward its better path. Judge Caprio's calm presence remained a soft anchor at the center of the room, A reminder that justice becomes truly meaningful only when it sees beyond the mistakes and into the hearts of those who make them. And the spectators who had come expecting routine hearings now found themselves deeply moved by a story they would carry with them long after they walked out the doors. If this moment touched you, it reminded you that compassion can diffuse even the loudest anger, that patience can reveal truths rage tries to hide, and that sometimes one act of understanding can change a person's entire direction. Then don't let this story end here. Share it. Let others see the power of calm in the face of fury, the strength of mercy when judgment feels easier, and the incredible impact of a judge who listens before he speaks. And if you want to keep witnessing real stories where justice meets humanity, where broken people find a chance to rebuild, and where a quiet moment can transform a life, then make sure you subscribe, join our community, and help us continue telling the stories that matter, because somewhere out there, someone might need this reminder more than you know.